Michael Knowles is an internet sensation, but few know of his acting background. We're going to talk about that and how narratives and culture shape history, and his new documentary on the wartime Pope. It's all on this Arroyo Grande. Come on. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Welcome to Arroyo Grande. Go subscribe to the show now and turn those notifications on. I want to keep you abreast of what's coming and don't want you to miss anything. And if you'd like to support the show and our work, please visit RaymondArroyo.com. Okay, Michael Knowles has become a streaming icon for many. His commentary on the Michael Knowles Show has drawn legions of followers. But where did he come from? And where does he think this culture is now? And why has he made it his task to retell the history of the Pope of the Second World War, Pius XII? Joining me now is Michael Knowles. Michael, thank you for being here. You have a series on Pius XII that you recently released on Daily Wire. And after immersing yourself in that time in history, I want you to catch us up to the present age. Do you have any reflections on how that time reflects on the time we occupy now? Do you see similarities?
Oh, of course. You know, the only two historical events that anyone is able to compare our politics to is the fall of Rome or the Second World War. I think it's because those are the only historical events anyone knows anything about.
Yeah, that's true.
And frankly, most people don't know much about those either. But yes, of course there is. And, you know, we're at a period of great cultural decay and confusion, political extremism, political violence in the streets, questions about the solidity of the political order, changing world order, rising powers, falling powers. So yes, of course, there are analogs, and a period of great cultural and religious ferment. So some happy news that we've seen is that the decades-long decline in Christian identity in the United States seems to have leveled off. It perhaps is going in the other direction. You know, the data are a little bit ambiguous. You are seeing a number of conversions and baptisms, especially among young people. You're seeing a return to church, a big spike in Bible sales, spurred in part because of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. You are seeing you are seeing signs of religious exploration. And so then the question is, all right, well, what are we going to find when we start exploring? And I guess this does pertain to the Pope Pius documentary on Daily Wire Plus. There's a lot of misinformation out there and a lot of propaganda. And so it can be hard for people who are primed for religion, who recognize that we have a need for God, the new atheism was nonsense, who are spurred toward the truth. Sometimes it's a little hard to separate fact from fiction.
Yeah, and I want to get into that. And in a moment, we're going to get into the entire, what I call the black legend of Pius XII. I mean, the man was canonized, considering the great work he did, and we can get into that. But what do you make? There's another parallel that, frankly, I find troubling. What do you make of the rising anti-Semitism chic, that's what I'll call it, that seems to have entered the mainstream now? I mean, what started as a disagreement over Israel's foreign policy has now really turned into this rabid hatred. Your sense of what we're seeing, and this goes across politics. You know, at one time, Michael, this was sort of confined to the far left. Now you're seeing it on the right as well.
You are. The left really mainstreamed it in many ways, and it really damaged them in the 2024 election because their supporters were wearing keffiyehs, you know, chanting about the Israeli state, and it complicated their elections. You've seen it crop up a little bit on the fringes of the right, and I think part of that is in response to the Gaza war and various war propaganda. I think you're also seeing that because it's so taboo breaking. And I think that there are some people in media and on social media in particular who benefit from breaking as many taboos as possible, be they on race, be they on religion. When it comes to anti-Semitism, it's a little bit of both. And it attracts a lot of attention. And just like a petulant little child, you know, they'll take any attention that they can get. And that in itself helps to mainstream them. So I think Christopher Rufo who's an excellent scholar, think tank scholar. He wrote a good piece in City Journal on this, in which he suggested that some of the anti-Semitism, not on the left but on the right, is really a kind of meta-political movement by streamers and podcasters to try to get attention. And it's actually somewhat divorced from actual nuts and bolts politics, but it's troubling nevertheless, because one can certainly criticize the Israeli state, and many people do, but this kind of racial or tribal hatred is really, really nasty. It poisons a lot. It really damaged the Democrats. So forget about morality for a second. Even just from a practical electoral standpoint, it's noxious, and we shouldn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah. No, well, again, this is the danger of the internet, because the clickbait and the constant need for attention and to top the guy next to you, yeah, as you said, the taboo destruction really ends up being the passport to clicks and to new audiences. So they're willing to go there because there's nothing else to lose.
Yes, I think that's right. You know, people need harder and harder hits. So you see this in, I don't know, violence on the internet. You know, it used to be that we would restrain the broadcasting of violence, but now we've mainstreamed it. And so I was speaking to someone the other day, a friend of mine at a cigar lounge, and he said, you know, it's the craziest thing. I've seen multiple people get murdered in high definition on Twitter this week. I'm getting desensitized to this. You hear about this especially when it comes to pornography, where the pornography becomes ever more extreme because people get desensitized to it. And so, you know, the kind of pornography that is prevalent today is not your grandpa's Playboy. You know, not to excuse that either.
Long shot. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's true when it comes to political rhetoric. In fact, a friend of mine made the observation that all of political media may have reached its logical extreme a couple of years ago when Kanye West showed up on the Alex Jones show and he said, "I love Hitler." Because there's no further taboo in our modern culture that you can break. You know, there's no more dopamine hit that you're going to receive. It's just as extreme as it possibly gets. So it serves the purposes of individual broadcasters. It does not serve the good of the political community. And so I hope that responsible people, don't give it any quarter.
Well, and as the creators of South Park said the other day, politics has become pop culture. So when this stuff enters the political realm, it poisons the entire culture. And that's what I'm most concerned about, just from my vantage point. I want to explore, Michael, how your career got here. And we've spoken before, but I want to get into some of this. I'll revisit some of what we talked about. There's much more I want to get into. As a kid, you were drawn to the theater, to acting of all things. What was it that attracted you? Was there one performance? Was there one sighting? I mean, I can remember seeing Yul Brynner on the stage and Rex Harrison as a kid and thinking, this could be fun.
You know, I was drawn to the theater and to politics for that matter before I was really even conscious. I had always wanted to be in show business and politics. For as long as I can remember, the first song that I ever learned, my grandpa taught it to me when I was 2, was "It's a Grand Old Flag." Very patriotic song, written by George M. Cohan, who was the king of Broadway. Yep. And I lived in New York, so I would see plays and musicals and things like that. I tried them out as a kid, and I was a lot better at acting than I was at playing football. So, some of it was a natural aptitude sort of thing. But it's really not a surprise that people who are in politics very often have some kind of theater or media or broadcast background because they use a lot of the same skills. You have to be able to speak intelligibly. You have to be able to connect with people. And at the best, version of it, you have to be concerned with the truth and you have to be, interested in people. Right. At the worst version of it, you have to be a liar and extremely egotistical. But, hopefully you do the better version of it. These are very helpful skills, and especially actually connecting this to our previous conversation, in an age in which people have the attention span of a fruit fly, and every medium of entertainment is no longer a 2-hour movie or even a 30-minute show. It's a 60-second reel on their phones. In that kind of an age, the training that you get in a theater, which is to memorize monologues, soliloquies, poems, to entertain this in your mind, to sustain a narrative over a long period of time. It's in many ways medicinal in our culture. There's a lot about the theater that is poisonous and terrible, and there's a reason that actors were lumped in with prostitutes and criminals for most of history. However, in our decayed culture, there's actually something salutary about it.
Yeah. You studied at the Stella Adler Conservatory when you were a teen or a young teen, and later with a guy named Wynn Handman, who I know was a disciple of Sandy Meisner. Tell me what you learned. Let's start with from the Stella Adler folks first. What of that training, if any, do you find yourself using today?
Well, I did not have the advantage of studying with the woman herself, I think, but I think someone else on this broadcast did. Well, however, this is somewhere the producer somewhere, and I came around a little bit later after she was off the stage. However, what I really learned at the Stella Adler School was, some nuts and bolts stuff, the power of stillness on the stage, kind of basic stagecraft, how to command an audience, but in a more theoretical way. Stella Adler focused on the power of imagination. And there are other acting teachers, most famously Lee Strasberg, who really wanted to focus on, the Strasberg method, was focusing on sense memory and your own personal experiences and living that on stage. And what I learned at the Adler School was that can actually take you out of a scene, that you really shouldn't be thinking about those experiences. There was a great line from Stella Adler herself, which I saw on video because she had already died. But she said, "Unless you are Danish royalty, there is nothing about the emotional experience of being dumped at prom that will teach you to play Hamlet. You have to use your imagination." And I think that's true. That's applicable certainly to the stage. It's applicable in people's personal lives and politically as well. I think a lot of our problems are caused by a failure of imagination.
I think you're right. Tell me about Wynn and what he taught you.
Wynn was magnificent. I studied with Wynn when he was 92. He was Sandy Meisner's assistant in the 50s. And I loved him. The guy was a devotee of George Bernard Shaw. He was left of Vladimir Lenin, World War II veteran. He was truly left as can be. I really, really loved the guy, though. Wonderful teacher. He was one of those rare acting teachers who was nurturing. He could be tough when he wanted to be. But a lot of acting teachers are just brutal and they'll pummel you into the ground. And he was quite nurturing, actually. And he, too, really had a strong focus on the imagination. Not to tell tales out of school. Well, they're both dead at this point. He referred to Lee Strasberg. He called him a pervert and a voyeur. He really didn't like that navel-gazing school of acting where it's all about the self. It's wonderful. And, lessons that I've learned in his class, continue to influence me today.
I would have thought listening to your broadcast, Stella was so fixated on breaking down the text before you, serving that text, and she thought the actor had to create a logical sequence of events. And I see that in your work. You don't kind of haphazardly jump around. You follow a logical progression and then you carry us to the next topic. That's very Adler. I mean, that really is. And then not worried about your, losing your cat at 3 and carrying that into the show. She hated that stuff too.
No, I'm so glad. That's a great point because I do endeavor to do that. And I think of a line actually that predates Adler, that Adler took from as she developed her technique, which is in the Stanislavski system, the Moscow Art Theater. Konstantin Stanislavski, his famous book, An Actor Prepares, in which he observes, look, actors have to have objectives that they're pursuing. They have to have actions that they are completing. And there needs to be a through line of action that gives coherence to the entire story. It was another lesson I learned at Adler, one of the teachers there whose name escapes me, which it seems kind of stupid. You say, what is the chief goal of the actor? And you had all these dumb responses to, experience emotion, to make you feel this, to do whatever. And he said, no, dummies, the chief goal is to tell the story. You're up there to tell a story.
That's it.
Good point.
Very utilitarian. Stella used to say, she'd sit on a throne, Michael. And, I studied with her when she was like 89 to 90. Yeah. So, 89 to 91 or so. And she would sit on the throne and they'd mic her up and there were speakers all around the room. So when she would critique you, it was like the voice of God thundering on all sides. You know, so you didn't know where it was coming from. And she could be brutal, like you said, very difficult. She could be nurturing too, especially to the men. The women, not so much. Well, I remember I had a friend, I won't say her name, but she was in NYU psychiatric services quite a few times. Because
Yes.
Stella would say, you know, she got up to do a scene, and Stella would turn to her and say, "Sweetheart, where did you get this outfit?" And she said, "Well, I got it at, you know, it's a negligee, and I thought it was right for the scene." "It's wrong for the scene. It's wrong for life, darling." And she said, "No man will sleep with you twice." Deadpanned it. Poor girl, broken into tears. But Stella, the great thing she taught me, Michael, and I do think this every time I walk into a theater, because they rarely do this, she said, your job as an actor is to stand on the platform and remind people of their own humanity. And I think, what a great line. And that's really our job, too, in some ways.
Yep.
It's to remind people of their humanity. Okay, then you go to Yale. This is what I don't understand. So here you are, you're pursuing acting, you're out, you're doing gigs as a kid. I mean, you were acting from the time you were 7.
Yeah.
You go to Yale, and you study history and Italian. Now, there's a graduate school of drama, but there's nothing for undergrads. Why go there?
Well, obviously, very practical majors, Italian literature and history. So I really wanted to get a job, you know. Yes. No, Yale has no pre-professional majors, so you can't study, you know, engineering or acting or any pre-law or anything like that. It's a liberal arts university. Yeah. And I did involve myself. I was a member of the Dramat and all the various acting companies, directed opera, translated plays. I immersed myself in that for no curricular credit whatsoever. But I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to study history and Italian literature in particular. To study Italian literature at university really just means you study Dante, Dante and Petrarch, maybe a couple other people. And I'm really glad. I mean, Dante's my favorite writer ever, because the purpose of a liberal education, in the classical sense of things, is to make sense of your freedom. The reason you don't study for a job or a trade or something is that you're actually cultivating your ability to make sense of leisure time. That's really what it's for. So you can think about your culture, so you can think about more abstract things. That's what it's supposed to be in principle. In practice, basically no university actually achieves that these days. Right. But it can spur certain loves and desires. And then after school, then you have to get the job training that, you know, will actually help you, be it in politics or show business or anything else.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned a play that you translated. You translated a play called The Girl from Andros, if I'm getting that correctly, which is a Machiavelli play.
Yes.
Another guy, incidentally, who dabbled in both stage and politics. So
that's right.
This is an early omen, Michael.
Yes, there's a theme going back to when I was about 3 years old, up through the university. And it's even more prophetic, though, because the girl from Andros, it means the girl from the island of men, right? And not Lesbos, it's Andros. Yeah. And I think in some ways that was a little hint of the transgender phenomenon that was going to take over in politics shortly thereafter. But in any case, a marvelous play. It was an ancient play by Menander, the Greek playwright. We've lost the original. Translated by Terence, the Latin playwright. Translated by Machiavelli. Then translated by me. Wow. We don't have to rank them in order of literary importance. But it's telling that Machiavelli, who really invents modern political science, it's telling that he was obsessed with the play. He wrote other plays, true, Mondragola, Clizia. He recognized, not to be too reductive about it, that sometimes politics really is downstream of culture. And he realized that you really can't separate those two things. And I think modern politicians should acknowledge that as well.
Well, I want to get to that in a moment and expand on it, but I don't want to miss this. At Yale, you befriend a Spencer Claven. Tell me how that led you to where you sit right now, and really this entire show.
Yes, I, of course, would always deny being friends with so disreputable a character as that Spencer Claven. But yes, he was a pal of mine in school. We lived in the same entryway of the same dormitory. I directed him in opera, as a matter of fact. He would be singing opera up and down the hallways, and I would open my door, I'd yell, I'd say, "Stop that beautiful singing! It's too the voice of an angel. Cut it out. I don't want to hear it." And so anyway, he reaches out to me. After graduating, I was working in politics and show business in New York. And he reaches out and he said, "Michael, a strange request. Could you help my father with some communications? I said, you're the only person I know who's a conservative who also works in show business. I said, who's your father? He said, well, my father is a novelist and a screenwriter who also does some political commentary. What's his name? I said, Andrew Claven. I said, oh, you're related to Andrew Claven. I probably should. It's not like your name is Smith. You know, it's kind of a weird name. I should have
put that
two and two together.
Michael.
Yes. And so I did some work for Drew for a little while. Drew and I, coincidentally, providentially, both moved to LA at the same time, separately. And then they start up this company. Originally, it was called Truth Revolt. Then they did a second version, a reboot of it. That was the nonprofit version. Then they did a for-profit version called Daily Wire. The head of Daily Wire, Jeremy Boring, calls me. He says, Michael, would you like to be, employee number 5 and start the social media department? And I didn't call him back because I said, I didn't move to LA to have a real job. No actor, no one working in political campaigns wants a real job. And he said, you idiot, why won't you let me give you health insurance? You're just like so stupid that you. So anyway, we started up. I said, it'll be a fun project for a year before the company goes bankrupt. And here I am a decade later. It still hasn't gone bankrupt.
You see that? Amazing. So now I want to talk about something you mentioned a moment ago. And I think we share this, that manners and the practice of a people, the culture, art, far outweighs politics and whatever the rage of the moment is in importance. And my question is, after doing this show for so many years now a decade at the Daily Wire, what is more important to the people watching and to you, politics or the culture?
They're very difficult to separate. Early on, Andrew Breitbart popularized this phrase that politics is downstream of culture. And there's a great deal of truth to it, but that phrase was abused by do-nothing politicians who wanted to be elected, receive the honors of office, and then not have the responsibility to actually do anything. So yes, it's certainly true that movies can shape our understanding of the political order. Likewise, the law is a teacher. And so when you subsidize certain behaviors, you get more of them. When you punish behaviors, you get fewer of them. That's a fact of politics. And so politicians have a responsibility too. I think there is a way to synthesize both of them, though, which you just alluded to. We think of politics as the laws, and we think of culture as the movies and the soundtracks. But you pointed out, no, it's the customs, it's the comportment, it's the behavior of a people, the manner in which we speak, the language which we use to speak, the way that we treat one another, the way that we gather and work together. That is actually a little bit of a blending of the two. And that's really important because a sure guide to ethics and morality is not going to be some utilitarian calculation that tries to ascertain how certain ends can justify certain means. That way lies evil and madness. Neither is it the listing of 5 bullet points on a manifesto and say, do this, don't do this. You can never fully encapsulate the intricacies of moral decision-making. To get back, we were talking about World War II. The Nazi comes to the door and says, are you hiding any Jews or something? How do you answer that question? It's wrong to lie, but it's wrong to betray people, and it's wrong to this and that. How? There is a third option, though. A view that was popularized by, or repopularized by Alistair MacIntyre, a Catholic philosopher, reviving the thought of Aristotle, thought that was very popular in the Middle Ages, which is virtue ethics, habits that we cultivate. Virtues, like vices, are just habits, and the more you do them, the easier they do, and the harder it is to do the opposite. And that sort of thing is going to be much, much more important than your zinger on Twitter. It's going to be much, much more important than your cockamamie moral calculation. How do you comport yourself? You want to tell me about your political agenda? Show me how you treat your family and your friends and your community. That's going to tell me a lot more about your political movement than some stupid essay or tweet.
Wow, I love that. I love that. And the manners, I've always thought, the manners, the virtue of a people is really the shape of that people. And you will never have stable political parties and a stable society if your people are debased. A thriving republic is impossible if the people are debased and broken. And so if we can somehow restore the virtue, restore the manners, everything else, and families, everything else, I think, will sort of adapt and take care of itself, but we worry about the externals, which really are the pop culture and politics. That's really the externals of what drives the whole thing. And I love that you speak to that often.
No, thank you. Yes, that's it. And, we live in such an abstracted, rationalistic, lazy, virtual age that we forget that. You really see the consequences in something like the transgender ideology, which says that our bodies have nothing to do with who we really are. I see how they came to that conclusion because we kind of behave that way. We text and we tweet and we surf online, and a lot of people work on computers all day. And so the body doesn't really matter. The way that you conduct yourself doesn't really matter. And in as much as it does, the internet encourages all the worst kinds of behaviors in interpersonal communications. So you have to kind of put your body back into it. It's not enough. And this has been an observation going back to classical antiquity all the way through Christian moral thought. It's not enough to understand virtue intellectually, to be able to talk about virtue, to be able to lecture on it. You have to actually do it. And so I love, you see this in our present culture, there are plenty of people who realize something was broken. Liberalism was broken. It encouraged bad ideas, all sorts of wacky behaviors, and that's wrong. And so they know to say that you should go to church, and they know to say you should get married early, and they know to say you should have a lot of kids. But then sometimes they don't do it. And it's very easy to talk and write and tweet. And it's actually relatively easy to make children, by the way. If anyone's confused, I have 3 children myself. It's easy and fun. But you
raising them,
raising them, getting married, going to mass, going to confession. These are the things that you have to do. They're going to matter a lot more than the great quote that you can recite.
Well, I want to tie this in later, too, because it's a big pet peeve of mine. Doctrine, I have always considered doctrine secondary to practice, because that is the doctrine that everyone reads and sees and experiences. And we have even churchmen who love to say, oh, the doctrine is unchanged, but we're doing it this way now. Well, that changes the doctrine entirely, because you are by your actions showing worship for one thing and disgrace or hatred for something else. But something is happening in Hollywood that I want to get your reaction to. And it's almost a new awareness of the limits of politics and perhaps an acknowledgement of the power of art. But I'm going to let you be the final ruler here. Jennifer Lawrence was asked by the New York Times recently to speak out on the Trump administration, and she said this.
As we've learned, election after election, celebrities do not make a difference whatsoever on who people vote for. And so then what am I doing? I'm just sharing my opinion on something that's going to just add fuel to a fire that's ripping the country apart. I mean, we are so divided. I don't want to start turning people off to films and to art that could change consciousness or change the world because they don't like my political opinions.
Michael, your reaction to the epiphany of Jennifer Lawrence?
If only she had the brevity and, incisiveness of Michael Jordan from the 1990s, who observed that Republicans buy sneakers too. Maybe she would have saved herself a lot of trouble. She's right.
Yeah.
People don't really care. I think the Trump elections, he won at least 2 of them, and they show that people have tuned out a lot of celebrities. The other reason for that is, just as we've had hyper specialization in all kinds of fields, in the university especially, these kind of niche specialists in some random field, or in corporate America, so too we've had it even in celebrity, which is that now we don't have to listen to Jennifer Lawrence's ill-informed views about politics, because we have people, influencers, whose entire job is to be political celebrities. And the president is the biggest celebrity on planet Earth. So even there, specialization, I think, has booted some of those Hollywood celebrities out of their newfound jobs, which is good. They should go back to the thing that they're actually good at, which is playing pretend.
Yeah, well, look, I I welcome this. I think it's almost a dawning of consciousness that the audience can have its own views, and forcing ideas upon them could be counterproductive to the whole thing you're there for, which is to get the audience to buy into your make-believe, right? I mean, that's really what the actor does. And it creates that separation. Let's admit it. There are people on both the right or left who they don't want to see certain actors because they oppose your political perspective. Why add that into the mix? I've always hated it, but I'm kind of glad you see the lights popping on. And maybe that's just the pain of the box office, Michael.
Think about what Philip Seymour Hoffman said. He was doing some interview. I have no doubt that Philip Seymour Hoffman was very liberal politically.
Yeah.
But I couldn't confirm it. I don't know for sure. And do you know why? Because he was once doing an interview. They asked his views on anything. I don't even think it was a particularly controversial political issue.
Yeah.
And he said, I don't want to talk about that. The less you know about me, the better. It's true. And he was probably the greatest actor of his generation.
Yeah, a great response. Okay, I want to talk about faith to bring this full circle. You fall away from your faith at 13, right after your confirmation. What happened and what brought you back?
Well, I have to correct you, Raymond. I fell away just before my confirmation.
Before your confirmation. Okay, that makes it a little better, actually.
I said to my mother, I don't believe I'm an atheist. Christopher Hitchens is really cool, whatever. And she said, you're going through a phase. You'll get over it eventually.
She didn't force you to do the confirmation.
It's not that she wouldn't have forced me, but she said, I recommend you receive your confirmation. You've received your sacraments. You've done your religious education. You're going through a stupid phase. You should be confirmed in the faith. And I trusted her. I said, fair enough. Okay, whatever. So I did. And I effectively apostatized. And I thought I was a very clever 13-year-old little boy. I was much smarter than, St. Athanasius, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas. So, yeah, of course. And get to school. The short version of the story is I meet a bunch of people who are a lot smarter than me, and most of them are atheists. But the very smartest ones were theistic. And a randomly or providentially assigned roommate presented me with one of the arguments for God, the ontological argument by St. Anselm of Canterbury, which St. Thomas Aquinas, he doesn't like the argument. He doesn't say it's a wrong argument. He just doesn't like it for various reasons. And but in any case, it got me. And, this is a very important point on evangelism, I think. What got me about the argument was in part that it's a sound argument. Even Bertrand Russell, the great logician of the 20th century, atheist, he said the ontological argument is sound. It's a fine argument. But what really got me is I fell away because of intellectual hubris. And I thought that religion was for dummies and atheism was for the smart people. What brought me back was maybe the substance of the argument, or maybe just the fact that I now saw that smart people could be religious. It was a kind of permission. And not everyone is going to be drawn in by that. Some people are going to fall away from religion because they're, emotionally damaged, or because they suffered a trauma, or because whatever. There are plenty of reasons. And I think the way that you have to pull people back in is to speak to that, to speak to whatever deficit they're feeling, to lead them to the truth, what is ultimately the truth, ever ancient, ever new.
Yeah. Tell me about the impact Father George Rutler had on your return to Catholicism quickly.
Absolutely inestimable, because as I'm seriously considering returning to faith, I'm 23 or so, 24. I'm in New York, and I'm at a show business event. It was a political show business event, actually. It was for conservatives who were in show business, a group called the Friends of Abe. And coincidentally, providentially, I'm at a restaurant that was owned by my friend's father. They were having the meeting there, and I see some books on the table, perfectly fine polemics by Sean Hannity and Ann Coulter, and whatever. And then there was this little weird book called Coincidentally, and the epigraph was from Alexander Pope, and it said, "All nature is but art unknown to thee, all chance direction which thou canst not see." I look down, it says by George Rutler. I look on the back, first blurb is from William F. Buckley Jr. I had just been the William F. Buckley student fellow at Yale. It says, "Save this as a valuable Rutler first edition." I open up the book, it's signed. I then look in the back, and my mind is swimming with the thought of returning to the faith. I'm almost in a daze at this point. I open up, what do you know? The guy who wrote the book is a Catholic priest. What do you know? It says he's the pastor of a church just a few blocks away. I said, this is a weird coincidence. And it's a book about coincidences. That's pretty weird.
There you go.
I then look him
Truth in
up.
advertising, Michael.
This even slightly weirder thing, I look him up. He's no longer at that church that I saw. He's been moved. And he's been moved to a church called St. Michael's. I said, I think I should go to that church. And there's a beautiful little stone design, a mosaic, when you walk in. And it says, the truth above all things. I went there. His preaching, his writing, his friendship, frankly, were of simply inestimable value in my return to the faith. And he celebrated the marriage of my wife and me. So it really, it's a wonderful, a great man of the church, great intellect. Just couldn't say enough good things about him.
Yeah, an old friend of mine as well. When did you first encounter the traditional Latin Mass, Michael? And why do you think that has a power that is now drawing so many young people? I mean, we both frequent the Latin Mass, and there's no denying the young are coming in huge numbers.
I was first turned on to the traditional Latin Mass as an adult coming back into faith by our aforementioned friend, Father George Rutler, who did not really celebrate the traditional Latin Mass, but there was a lot of Latin and a lot of chanting in his liturgy, in the Rutlerian rite. And so I said, well, that's kind of odd. It's not just happy, clappy things with, felt banners or whatever. And then it reminded me, one time I was in Rome after the motu proprio. I was away from the faith. It was during the pontificate of Benedict. And I did see the difference. I walked in during an Italian Novus Ordo Mass, but I stayed, and the High Latin Mass began. I noticed it immersed you in Scripture, of course. The fact that statistically all of the saints for all of history had access to this Mass, a Mass that was substantially formed by the year 600, Gregory the Great, and that endured until it was suppressed in the middle of the 20th century, and now it's kind of come back. To me, that's a good recommendation of the Mass. And I because it's brought so many, especially young people, back into the faith, I certainly hope that some of the restrictions that were put onto it in recent years, I hope that the Holy Father, Pope Leo, will consider lifting them and allowing a springtime for the Church, as I suspect will occur.
No, I was going to ask you about that. The inexplicable banning and shunning and shaming of people, young and old, who love the old rite, love the traditional Latin Mass, and they're treated like lepers, or worse, treated like pagans. You can't even come into the parish anymore.
Yes.
There's a huge disconnect there. At a time when everyone's saying we should be synodal and listen and walk with everybody, yet here are your most fervent believers, the people who want to be there unlike anybody else, and you basically lock the door in their faces.
Yes, I sure would love a little accompaniment, a little ecumenism maybe for that. But I totally understand why, which is that in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, the reform came about. Let's not forget, what became the Mass of Paul VI it was not an essential part of the Second Vatican Council, and frankly, what is often practiced today as the Novus Ordo Missae is really far afield of what the Council called for.
What was intended, yeah.
Yes, however, there was a feeling among clergy and some lay people that the Second Vatican Council abrogated tradition. Now we don't have to deal with that anymore. We're in a new era. It's the age of Aquarius, and everything's going to change. And maybe some of them had good intentions. Maybe they thought it was really going to work, and it didn't. And it didn't fill up the pews, and it didn't bring a lot of Protestants over, which was one of the goals. And it just didn't achieve the pastoral aims that many of them set out for. And so what do you do when something's not working? Maybe you try something else. Maybe you try something that's worked pretty well in the past. That's a reasonable thing to do. However, it became a fight over the council, at least in the minds of the radicals and the liberals. And it's totally ridiculous. You don't have to reject the important parts of the Second Vatican Council in order to point out that felt banners and like lame guitar songs are not the most conducive to sanctity and reverence.
Yeah, well, priest coming out of a casket dressed as Dracula, which I saw from Germany this week, and a priest on the skateboard coming down the aisle. Not what we need
No.
in worship of God. I don't
How
think
do
that's
you do,
what
fellow
any council
kids? Yeah.
intended. Yeah, good evening, kids. Okay, you have a new series on Daily Wire that kind of draws together your love of history, your faith, your flair for the dramatic. It's called The Pope and the Führer, the secret Vatican files of World War II. Now, I'm old enough to remember, Michael, John Cornwell's horrible book, Hitler's Pope, which really reanimated the black legend of Pius XII, the wartime Pope, as an accomplice to Hitler. But that really wasn't the source of this narrative. What was? And tie that to our entire conversation here.
It was total nonsense, and I remember when it came out. And I didn't know anything about Pius XII, so I stupidly believed it. Now we know better than to trust popular books and news media and all the rest of it. Pope Pius XII was the Vatican Secretary of State during the pontificate of Pius XI, and he chooses the name Pius to show continuity here. This is a man deeply involved. He also was papal nuncio in Germany, so he knew Hitler for what he was from the beginning. He was deeply involved in encyclicals such as Mitbrennender Sorge, warning about the rise of Nazism in Germany and in the vernacular. Hitler wrote to Francisco Franco, said that Pope Pius XII was his personal enemy. Pius XII attempted a long-distance exorcism of Hitler from the Vatican. Hitler certainly wanted to kidnap the Pope and probably wanted to execute him. There was no love lost between these two. People knew it. After the war, Pius XII is honored in Israel. The chief rabbi of Rome, Israel Zoli, converts to Catholicism and, in fact, takes the name Eugenio, Eugene, the Christian name of Pius XII.
Name.
Yes. This is pretty clear. Everyone knows about this guy's bravery in the war. And by this guy, I mean the Holy Father, the last significant figure to stand firm in Rome as the enemies are all around. Saved hundreds of thousands of Jews, many hundreds of thousands of Jews. In any case, fast forward to, was it 1963 or thereabouts?
Yep.
This stupid play is written called The Deputy. It is an interminable play. It's about 8 hours long. If it were to be performed in its entirety, it never was performed in its entirety. No one would have stayed for it.
Wow.
And the argument of this work of fiction is that the Pope loved Hitler and collaborated with Hitler. It was total nonsense. It was promoted by the KGB. And it worked. It worked to develop this narrative, which then is resuscitated in the various Pius XII fights, notably the Cornwell book, Hitler's Pope. Now, part of the reason that this worked, I think, is because of the context of the Second Vatican Council that happens in the 60s and all the fights to follow. That in many ways, the fight over the legacy of Pius XII is not even totally about the secularists or the Germans and the Jews or the KGB or whatever. In many ways, it's an intra-Catholic battle between the traditionalists and the modernists or something. Because Pius XII was an emblem of Catholic continuity and tradition. He wore the papal tiara. He had the dignity of the seat of Peter. And so I think there were opportunists who really wanted to abrogate tradition. Pope Benedict XVI points out, we have to have a hermeneutic of continuity. Yeah. If some modern declaration seems to contradict all of church history, we can't get rid of everything the church has always believed in favor of this innovation. We have to read whatever is new in light of the tradition.
That's kind of a fascinating take, though, on this, Michael, because look, I've heard so many facets of why. Why did they want to destroy the legacy and the reputation of Pius XII? And I've heard he was a militant anti-communist, so it was in the interest of the Russians to destroy his legacy. But that makes more sense to me, that it really is an inter-Catholic battle over tradition and novelty, and that Pius XII, in many ways, he embodied that tradition and, as you said, was the only figure to stand firm against Hitler in reality. Why was he so quiet, though? I mean, you hear that critique all the time. I know there are audiences, I remember reading them, where he denounces Hitler, but it's in a gentle way. But behind the scenes, he's far more active And both.
Yes, he's working with various diplomats and spies, and he's saving lots and lots of Jews in Rome, working very hands-on to save them from being rounded up, but also throughout Europe. I mean, I think the Israeli estimate is over 800,000 Jews were saved by the Pope and his actions. So why didn't he give a big speech where he said, that Hitler's a nasty fellow and we hate him? Because it would have only made things worse.
Yeah.
First of all, you have to remember, they've just concluded the Lateran Treaty. The Italian nationalists have formally stolen the Papal States, though that was a process that began over a century before.
Yeah.
And the Pope is politically a little bit weak. Then you look at what happens to the bishops who did speak out in a really direct way.
That's right.
The Dutch bishops are the clear example of this. It led to the deportation of thousands of Jews as punishment for the Dutch bishops speaking out. The Pope knew that if he spoke out in such a way, the number would be millions. And so he suffered a kind of a white martyrdom in order to do the most good, to protect Hitler's victims, certainly, to protect the church, obviously, a top priority for the Pope. And he was willing to become a true martyr as well. He had a letter in his desk in which he renounced the papacy. If Hitler and the goons had actually kidnapped him, that was to be pronounced. And so they would have had merely a priest on their hands, like maybe a bishop, but they would actually not a bishop, because they would have had the Bishop of Rome. So he renounced it. They would have had a priest. They could have done with him as they liked, and then the Curia would have gone, and there would have been a conclave, and they would have elected some new pope in exile. But this is a man who was willing, really, not to think of himself, to put everyone else first.
No, I remember interviewing years ago nuns in Roman convents, Michael, who, I remember them telling me one story where at night messages came from the Pope, handwritten messages from Pius XII that said, you are to admit women and their children into this convent and then destroy this letter, which they did. And this nun said, we didn't want anybody here. We were worried for our own lives, but we did it under obedience to the Pope. And so the mothers and their children stayed there. The fathers were dressed as Franciscan monks and stayed across the street. And they would meet at night. It's an amazing, but to see these were women in their 90s at the time. And they told me one story where the Nazis are coming and they're checking all of the convents and the monasteries, and they knock on the door, and the babies are crying, and the women are frightened. So they put the mothers and children under the stage in kind of their auditorium area. The nuns get on the stage and start pretending that they're rehearsing a show. The Nazis are looking everywhere. They find no kids, no mothers, and they leave. This shows you there was enormous heroism that happened, and none of that would have occurred without Pius XII.
And when we're talking about the Pope specifically, he personally housed Jews at Castel Gandolfo, at the papal residence. Yeah. So this is obviously directives to the entirety of the church, hence that very large number. He's personally involved in this himself.
What did you learn from the new documents released by the Vatican Archives a few years ago?
Well, the Vatican Archives have been opened up, and so now we have lots of cables that don't really tell us anything new. Yeah, they confirm what we already knew for people who are willing to look at the truth. So there are all sorts of spy documents and diplomatic cables and all the rest of it. Some interesting details there. But the real story has been suppressed far longer. We've known the facts since the 1940s. And so I hope that the Pope and the Führer lays it out clearly and gives you good ammunition for your revisionist friends and relatives who want to further calumniate a marvelous and virtuous man.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, you went into such detail in this multi-part series, and I've been speaking to researchers and even witnesses who worked in the Vatican or were near the Vatican at the time. It's an amazing history, but it's so obscured, and it's because of, and it kind of ties into everything we've been talking about. It started with this ridiculous play, The Deputy, that kind of began this black legend that has persisted in various forms, whether it's the New York Times or Cornwell. I read an article the other day that said, no, we need to open up the Vatican bank records. That will tell us how much money the Pope made off of. It's like, when does this ever end? I mean, of course. You've got Pius warning FDR about the Holocaust, and they don't want to hear about it.
That's right. It's a reminder of the consequences of very bad theater. Maybe it's good that we lumped in thespians with criminals throughout all of history. Maybe they had a point.
Bad theater has its consequences, and it never ends well. Michael, thank you for being here. And you can watch the series, The Pope and the Führer, at Daily Wire. And I thank you, Michael, for your time.
Well, Raymond, the pleasure's all mine. Thank you for having me.
We'll talk to you soon. Thank you. And I hope you'll come back to Arroyo Grande soon. Why live a dry, constricted life when if you fill it with good things, it can flow into a broad, thriving Arroyo Grande? I'm Raymond Arroyo. Make sure you like this episode. Subscribe, and like us. Thanks for diving in. We'll see you next time. Bye now. Arroyo Grande is produced in partnership with iHeart Podcasts and DP Studios and is available on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.